The moment Hana Park realized her stepmother was actually sending her away, she felt as if the ground beneath her had disappeared. She stood outside the small apartment she had called home for years, holding a worn bag against her chest while the cold Seoul wind moved through her hair. Her stepmother, Mrs. Choi, stood in the doorway with an expression that showed no regret. In her hand was a single $100 bill. "Take it and leave," she said coldly. Hana stared at the money, then at the woman who had raised her since her father's death. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking. Mrs. Choi held out the money toward a poorly dressed man standing across the street beneath a broken streetlight. He looked like a homeless stranger, wearing an old coat and carrying a faded backpack. "You're his responsibility now," Mrs. Choi said. Hana's eyes widened. "You can't sell me." Mrs. Choi rolled her eyes. "Don't make this dramatic. I'm tired of feeding you, paying your bills, and watching you waste your life." Hana felt tears forming in her eyes. She had spent years working part-time jobs while taking care of the apartment. She had cooked meals, cleaned rooms, and endured countless insults without ever complaining because she believed family was supposed to stay together. After her father died, she had hoped her stepmother would become kinder, but instead every year had brought more cruelty. "I'm your family," Hana whispered. Mrs. Choi gave a bitter laugh. "Family? Your father is gone. I have no reason to keep pretending anymore." She then walked toward the stranger and placed the $100 bill into his hand. "Take her with you. I don't care where you go." Hana stepped backward in disbelief. "Please, don't do this." But Mrs. Choi had already turned away. The door slammed shut, leaving Hana alone on the sidewalk with a stranger she had never met. She looked at the man nervously, expecting him to demand something from her, but instead he simply watched her with a calm expression. After a long silence, he asked, "Are you hurt?" Hana shook her head, unable to understand why a stranger seemed more concerned about her feelings than the woman who had just thrown her out. Hana followed the mysterious man through the quiet streets of Seoul, still struggling to understand how quickly her entire life had fallen apart. The rain had begun to fall harder, and she pulled her thin jacket closer around herself as they walked beneath rows of glowing streetlights. The man introduced himself as Daniel, but he said almost nothing about his past. He simply walked at a steady pace, carrying his old backpack over one shoulder while Hana followed several steps behind. Finally, she gathered enough courage to ask, "Where are you taking me?" Daniel looked back at her and replied calmly, "Somewhere you can stay tonight." Hana hesitated. "You live on the street, don't you?" Daniel gave a faint smile. "That's what it looks like." His answer confused her, but she had nowhere else to go. After several more minutes, they reached an old building hidden between two narrow streets. Daniel unlocked a small apartment and opened the door. Hana expected a dirty room filled with discarded boxes, but instead she found a simple, surprisingly clean place. There was a small table, a sofa, a bookshelf, and a tiny kitchen. Everything was arranged neatly. Daniel placed his backpack near the sofa and said, "You can sleep here." Hana looked around nervously. "What about you?" "I'll sleep on the sofa," he answered. She stared at him. "Why are you helping me?" Daniel remained quiet for a moment before saying, "Because someone should." Those words stayed in Hana's mind. She had spent years hearing that she was a burden, that she cost too much, and that she was never good enough. Yet this stranger, who appeared to have almost nothing, was offering her a safe place without asking for anything in return. The next morning, Hana woke to the smell of warm soup. Daniel was standing in the tiny kitchen, preparing breakfast. He placed a bowl on the table and told her to eat. Hana looked at the food and asked, "Why are you doing all this?" Daniel simply replied, "You haven't eaten properly." She lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the kindness. Later that day, Daniel helped her find temporary work at a small cafe nearby. He even gave her advice about dealing with customers and managing money. Hana quickly noticed that Daniel understood business far better than an ordinary homeless man should. He could calculate numbers in his head, spoke fluent English, and knew complicated details about major companies in Seoul. One evening, unable to control her curiosity anymore, Hana looked directly at him and asked, "Daniel, who are you really?" Daniel looked at Hana for several seconds after she asked who he really was, but instead of answering, he quietly turned toward the window and watched the rain sliding down the glass. "I'm just a man who made some mistakes," he finally said. Hana frowned because his answer only made her more suspicious. Everything about him seemed strange. He dressed like someone who had nowhere to go, yet he spoke with the confidence of a highly educated businessman. He understood investments, technology, international markets, and corporate strategy. Even the way he carried himself seemed completely different from the homeless people Hana had seen on the streets. Still, she decided not to pressure him. She had already learned that Daniel helped her without expecting anything in return. And that was enough for her to trust him. What Hana didn't know was that Daniel Kang had been missing from Seoul's business world for nearly 3 weeks. Across the city, executives at Kang Holdings were desperately searching for their chairman and CEO. Daniel Kang was not an ordinary businessman. At only 34 years old, he had built Kang Holdings into one of South Korea's most powerful private companies, with investments in technology, finance, real estate, and international trade. Business magazines regularly described him as Seoul's youngest billionaire CEO. His face appeared on television, newspapers, and online news sites, but almost nobody knew where he had gone. Daniel had intentionally disappeared. He had grown tired of watching people change the moment they discovered his wealth. Employees treated him with exaggerated respect. Strangers wanted favors, and people who claimed to care about him often cared more about his money. So he created another identity and began living like a homeless man, determined to discover how people behaved when they believed he had nothing. During those weeks, he had been ignored, insulted, and sometimes treated as if he were invisible. Then he met Hana. She had every reason to hate the world after being thrown out of her own home, yet she never treated Daniel with contempt. When she had only enough money to buy one meal, she offered to share it with him. When she found a warm jacket at a second-hand store, she asked whether he needed one before thinking about herself. Daniel began watching her closely, not because he wanted to test her anymore, but because her kindness seemed genuine. One evening, Hana returned from work carrying 2 small sandwiches. She placed one in front of Daniel and smiled. "I thought you might be hungry." Daniel looked at the sandwich, then at her face, and realized that for the first time during his strange experiment, he had stopped thinking about whether someone knew his identity. Mrs. Choi had no idea that the decision she made for $100 was about to expose everything she had spent years hiding. After throwing Hana out, she assumed the problem was finished and believed the young woman would eventually return, desperate for forgiveness. But days passed, and Hana never came back. Instead, Hana began building a new life with the mysterious man named Daniel. She found steady work at the cafe, started saving money, and slowly regained the confidence her stepmother had taken away from her. Daniel remained beside her, quietly encouraging her whenever she doubted herself. Meanwhile, Mrs. Choi became curious about the man who had taken Hana away. At first, she only wanted to make sure Hana was not causing trouble. But then she heard a rumor from someone in the neighborhood. The homeless man Hana was living with seemed to have connections to powerful people. Mrs. Choi became suspicious and decided to follow Hana one afternoon. She watched from across the street as Hana entered a large business district with Daniel. Mrs. Choi followed them from a distance until they reached the enormous headquarters of Kang Holdings, one of Seoul's most successful corporations. She watched Daniel walk toward the main entrance without hesitation. Security guards immediately recognized him. They straightened their posture and greeted him respectfully. Then, several executives rushed out of the building. One of them nearly ran toward Daniel before stopping in front of him and saying, "Chairman Kang, we have been searching everywhere for you." Mrs. Choi froze. Her heart began pounding as she stared through the glass doors. "Chairman Kang?" She quickly searched his face on her phone and felt the blood drain from her face when she saw his photograph. The homeless man she had accepted $100 to take Hana away was Daniel Kang, the billionaire CEO she had seen on television countless times. Suddenly, everything made sense. His expensive knowledge, confident manner, fluent English, and unusual understanding of business were never an accident. Mrs. Choi immediately realized that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. She rushed toward Hana and tried to act as if nothing had happened. "Hana, you need to come home," she said. Hana looked at her with disbelief. "Why?" Mrs. Choi struggled to answer. "I was angry. I made a terrible mistake." Hana remembered standing outside that apartment with a $100 bill being handed to a stranger. "You didn't make a mistake," she said quietly. "You chose to sell me." Mrs. Choi's expression changed as she realized Hana was no longer the frightened young woman she had controlled for years. Hana stood quietly in the elegant office of Kang Holdings, still trying to understand how the homeless man she had trusted had turned out to be one of the most powerful businessmen in Seoul. Daniel stood near the window, looking down at the busy streets below, while Mrs. Choi sat across from them, unable to hide her embarrassment. She had arrived expecting to regain control over Hana, but everything had changed the moment she discovered Daniel's identity. "Hana, please come home," Mrs. Choi said again, her voice much softer than before. Hana looked at her with a calm expression. "Why should I?" Mrs. Choi lowered her eyes. "Because I treated you badly, and I want to make things right." Hana shook her head. "You only want me back because you know who Daniel is." Mrs. Choi had no answer. Daniel finally turned around and spoke firmly. "She doesn't owe you anything." The room became silent. For years, Hana had been made to feel worthless. But now someone was standing beside her without asking for anything in return. Daniel told Hana that he wanted to offer her a position at Kang Holdings, not because he felt sorry for her, but because he had watched her work hard, even when life gave her every reason to give up. He had seen how quickly she learned, how carefully she handled responsibilities at the cafe, and how naturally she understood people. "You have ability," Daniel told her. "You just never had anyone willing to give you a real opportunity." Hana was overwhelmed. She had spent years believing that her future was limited by the circumstances of her childhood. Now, for the first time, she was being offered a chance to decide what she wanted for herself. She accepted the position and began working at Kang Holdings. The first few months were difficult, but Hana refused to quit. She arrived early, stayed focused, and learned everything she could from the experienced employees around her. Some people doubted her because she had no business degree or wealthy family behind her. But Daniel never treated her differently. He judged her by her effort and results. Slowly, Hana earned the respect of the people around her. She eventually moved into a small apartment of her own, bought new clothes with money she had earned herself, and began enjoying simple things she had once thought were impossible. Her stepmother, meanwhile, faced the consequences of her own choices after her financial problems became public. Hana could have used Daniel's influence to punish her, but she refused. She simply walked away and focused on building the future she had once been denied. 1 year later, Hana stood beside Daniel at a major company event, dressed confidently and surrounded by people who respected her. A reporter asked her what had changed her life so completely, and Hana looked at Daniel before answering with a quiet smile. Remembering the night she had stood outside her old home with nothing but a bag in her hands and $100 price placed on her worth.